All right, good morning, everyone. We are in 1 Samuel 26. This is lesson 11. So you'll remember that this lesson's covering 24, 25, and 26, and for good reason. 24 and 26 have a lot in common with each other. Both David will find Saul in a vulnerable position. There will be a choice for David to make as to whether he thinks that he should kill Saul or not, and people who are trying to tell him to do that. And 25 was kind of the outlier event in there where David almost gives in to his anger and rage about what Nabal has done to him, how he's been offended and insulted by him, and so he had determined that he was going to kill Nabal and all of those servants who were there. We saw last week that Abigail was able to stop him from that, able to convince him that it was not good for him to take the blood guilt in this, that Nabal was not worth this sin and this evil for David to do. And David was very impressed by that. God did strike Nabal dead, and then David took Abigail to be his wife. And that brings us to chapter 26. Now, chapter 26 in some ways comes out of nowhere, because in 24, how did Saul and David part ways?
Good.
Yeah, as good as it's been in a long, long time. So Saul had said that he was not doing what was right. He should have not been pursuing David, and he knows that David's going to be the next king. David was not willing to kill Saul then. And why wasn't David willing to kill Saul? Excuse me?
He's God's anointed.
Yeah, he's God's anointed. Yeah, absolutely. So David did not see that it was his place to kill God's anointed. So then in 26, it's like it never happened. And some time has passed, and clearly Saul has forgotten, or maybe not exactly forgotten, but is thinking differently now, and still views David as a threat. And so we see that the Ziphites come to Saul at Gibeah, and they give some intel. They know where David is. He's out there in the wilderness of Ziph. These are the same people who tipped Saul off last time in chapter 23. So they have been willing to help Saul, trying to get in his good graces, and to tell him that, yes, David is hiding out somewhere in our region. So Saul takes 3,000 men over to the wilderness of Ziph, and the last we knew about for David, David had 600 men with him. So if that is still true, then Saul has quite a few more than David does, and intends to be victorious and to destroy David and his whole army. Now, Saul is camped out on the hill of Hachilah, and David is still in the wilderness. And David knows that Saul is coming after him, and he's able to get some intel of his own. He's sending out scouts or spies to be able to figure out where Saul is, and he learns where Saul is before Saul learns exactly where David is. So now we again have an imbalance of information, and David makes a strange choice here. You would think that if Saul is chasing after him, that David would get as far away from Saul as possible, and he knows where Saul is. But instead he goes to Saul, and he gets in range to be able to see the camp that Saul is in. So he looks down, he's able to see that Saul and Abner are there. Abner is the commander of Saul's army, and they are all sleeping. And why are David and Abishai able to sneak into the camp so effectively? Okay, because God put a deep sleep on them. And that's only told to us after some of these events have happened. You got to get down to verse 12 or so before that is revealed. And if you haven't noticed that yet, then the rest of this seems almost hard to believe, because there's a whole crowd of soldiers. Saul and Abner are in the middle of the camp. There's a ton of different people who are sleeping, and they're creeping through the camp, and they're having conversations as they do so. You think, what are the odds that out of 3,000 men that somebody's going to wake up? You know, somebody's going to be a light sleeper. Somebody's going to be tossing and turning. David and Abishai are going to, accidentally kick the foot of one of them as they go by or something. Something's got to happen, right? But the narrative does not give the praise to David and Abishai for being so stealthy and so sneaky that they're able to do this without anybody waking up. We are told specifically that it's God who disables Saul's army. It's God who keeps them in a heavy sleep, so that David and Abishai are able to do this. That does impact some of what this story is about.
But it's also the devil working, because he's trying to tempt David to go ahead and kill him. And he even tempts him with David's servant.
Yeah.
His servant is saying, hey, let's kill him.
Yeah.
So the devil's still tempting there.
Yeah, there's nothing saying that the devil can't use these kinds of opportunities, even an opportunity for good, even an opportunity where God is keeping David safe, where Satan can still have some influence and still try to get David to do something that's not really going to be a very good decision. So they creep up on Saul and Abner. And what do they see when they get to Saul? Yeah, got a spear in the ground near his head, which, I don't know, just an interesting detail to me. But remember, that royal spear, that is emblematic of Saul's royal authority. When we saw him previously, he was up, under a tree on the hill there in the royal city of Gibeah, with spear in hand and his royal court all around. This is representative of his power and his authority. And right now, since he is sleeping, he's not holding it in hand. It is stuck in the ground next to him. He is safe. He does not feel any danger. He's got his whole army around him, and presumably some people who are supposed to be on watch. But this is a very vulnerable position. And in 24, we saw a similar one, where Saul was there in the same cave as David, but David and his men were further in, and Saul was there to relieve himself and was caught with his pants down, so to speak. And this was an opportunity for David to kill Saul. And that's what his men wanted him to do there in that cave. They viewed Saul as their enemy. They knew they were on the run. They believed that David was going to be the next king. This is the opportunity to make our problems go away. Well, here we have really the same sort of thing, except David has taken even a more active role in getting to Saul. There in the cave, Saul was just kind of there. It just happened. At this time, David has chosen to go into Saul's camp, chosen to get next to him, and has now put himself in this situation where Saul is vulnerable before him. So what is Abishai's assessment of the situation? Yeah, let's kill him. Let's do it. And he even offers to do it himself. He says, please allow me to take this spear and to pin him to the earth. It'll only take one strike. I won't need two. And for Saul to be, killed with his own royal spear would certainly be quite a chaos-inducing event. For him to be killed in the middle of a camp where he is supposed to be safe, where there are supposed to be all these people who are protecting him, that also would have created just so much chaos. Why do you think Abishai offered to do this himself?
He knew David didn't want to.
Yeah, I think he probably did know that, David had refused to do so before. David had told his men that he did not see it right to kill the Lord's anointed. Abishai probably knows this and probably sticks out to him to such a great degree, because I have to imagine that a lot of David's men think he's crazy for thinking that way. Because they see, like I said before, that they're a rebel force, that they're supposed to defeat Saul. They're on the run for now, but when the tide can turn, well, then we're going to attack and we're going to take over. So Abishai sees this opportunity, knows that David is hesitant to kill Saul himself, and says, I'll do it. And presumably Abishai could have gone on to say, why don't you go out of the camp? You get to safety. Let's give David some plausible deniability. Let's give David an opportunity to not be involved in it himself and say, you just go out of the camp and whatever happens here is what happens here, right? But David is not going to play any of those games. He's not going to allow anyone else to do what he does not think it is right to do. And so, what is David's assessment of this situation? How does he view all of this? Yeah, Dave.
Well, first off, I don't see where, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see where the Lord told him to go kill him like that.
Yeah.
That's murderous.
Yeah.
So what his response was to Abishai was, who of you would kill him, the Lord's anointed? There's guilt involved with that. So it leads me to believe that God had greater plans than just going there and stick a spear in his face.
Yeah. Right, absolutely. God never told David to kill Saul. David is not going to just assume it is a good thing to do. He actually feels very strongly that killing the Lord's anointed is sinful and an evil act. And you will notice again that, like we saw before, in verse 8, Abishai said, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Giving credit to God for this, saying God has given you this opportunity. That's the same thing they told him in the cave. God has delivered your enemy to you. Take this opportunity. Now, in a way that's true, God had delivered Saul to David, but that doesn't necessarily mean that David should just kill Saul. Now,
I always looked at it as a test of David, because, that's one way God checks how sincere we are about our belief
Yeah.
in the anointed one. And also I point out that the anointed one position is what Saul was, what David was respecting.
Yes.
Not necessarily Saul.
yeah, absolutely. And that's an important thing. David knows that Saul has a lot of sin and knows that Saul is acting in some pretty bizarre ways. And I know that he's got to be thinking, I don't want to be the kind of king that Saul is. When it's my time, I'm going to do things differently. And rightfully so. God had rejected Saul, said that he needed a better man to take his place. And so David has good reason to say, I'm not going to do things the way that Saul did. I'm going to have a different kind of life and a different kind of rule. Dave?
Verses 9 through 12, David himself said, the Lord has forbidden me
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah. Right.
He couldn't have killed him who didn't right God. And
Yes.
That, he said that.
Yes. And David's been consistent in that belief that this is not a good thing for him. And this all boils down to the fact that David does not consider Saul to be his enemy. He'll kill the Philistines because they're the enemies of God's people. They're oppressing them, and they are working this great evil, and God has issued a judgment against them. But that doesn't mean that David's just going to go around killing whoever he wants willy-nilly. And even though he kind of almost did that in the last chapter, because he did lose control, He was thankfully stopped from that, and Abigail was correct in her assessment that it would have been sinful and he would have had blood guilt upon him if he had gone and massacred those people, even though there was an insult. Now, David has reasons why he should kill Saul. You can come up with lots of reasons why that might be a good idea. But he respects that position, like Alan was saying, respecting the honor and the authority of being God's anointed, and knowing that that is not a trivial thing. Lauren?
He trusts that the Lord will provide in his situation. He knows he is to be the next king. And he says here in verse 10 that as the Lord lives, the Lord shall strike him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall go into battle or perish. It's not up to me. God will make that decision. I'll leave it in his hand. He trusted that the Lord would take care of that.
Yeah.
It wasn't up to him. He was to wait for that moment of prayer.
Right, yes. God will take care of Saul the way that he sees fit. Maybe he'll die in battle, which is actually what's going to happen. Maybe it will, be that he dies of old age. He might. Nothing about God's promise says that David's going to become king quickly or before Saul's natural end. God's not made any promises that way. God could strike Saul directly. David just saw God do that with Nabal and knows that that is under the umbrella of possibilities.
I mean, what a lesson to us to remember to wait on God's time.
Mhm.
I mean, all of this persecution that he's gone through is someone that is important to him, that he loves, even as his father-in-law. Right?
Yeah.
And yet, he could sit there throughout all of this situation and say things like, "Poor me, I don't deserve this." But at the end of the
Yeah.
day, his trust is where it needs to be, and he's waiting patiently for God's time.
Yeah. Think about all the things that David could have said here. Could have said, God chose me, not Saul. I'm supposed to be the next king. Let's just get this show on the road and get it done with. Or Saul's trying to kill me. If I don't kill him here, then maybe tomorrow he catches up with me. And tomorrow he kills me. Or look at all the great evil that Saul is doing. The nation is getting worse day by day because Saul is king. I will do a better job. Saul needs to be removed from power. All these reasons that sound halfway reasonable. Sound like they're not even that bad of an idea. Yet David knows that the higher standard here is that Saul right now is king over Israel. He is God's anointed. There's something special to that. And unless he hears specifically from God that he is supposed to kill Saul, he's not going to let that happen. It will eventually happen that Saul dies, and then David will go on to be king, but he's going to follow through with what God does here, not with what David wants to do. And it doesn't make things any better to have Abishai do it. That's a loophole that a lot of people want to use for sin. If I can get somebody else to actually commit the sin for me, then it's better than if I did it myself. I mean, not really. That's if David tells him, yes, go ahead and do this, how is that any different than David picking up the spear himself? That's nonsensical.
Yeah, but he will in the future send, his husband,
Uriah, yes.
He
Yeah.
will do it.
Yes, he will do it. And that is a reasoning that he's willing to accept at that time. That ends very poorly for him, of course. And he recognizes later that there's really no difference in blood guilt. But that's a good example. Is David any less guilty when he sends Uriah out to battle with the express purpose of having him killed? He's manipulated the events, and no, he's not raised up a sword against him himself, but he is just as guilty. So he recognizes it here. It would have been better if he would have recognized it with Uriah as well, but this is how things go. Okay, so David and Abishai do not kill Saul. But David says, now, take now the spear of it that is at his head and a jar of water, and let us go. Why do they take the spear and water jar? Yeah. Yeah, and Saul would realize that it was gone for both of them. You know, the water jar is something that specifically belonged to Saul. The spear, again, something that specifically belongs to him, but also it represents his power and authority. Now, this is kind of similar to what he did when he cut off the corner of Saul's robe, right? A way of saying, I was here. I could have killed you. Yeah, go ahead.
Not only was he there, but he had the weapon right there.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, this was right on my head. It's
Yeah.
not there now.
Right. I mean, if you were able to pick it up and take it, you're also able to pick it up and just plant it right in Saul's head or whatever, and he would be dead. And this is an obvious message to Saul. You could have died tonight, but you didn't because I chose not to kill you. Now, I want you to think about, while we're going through this, and we're going to explore this some more, David regretted cutting off the corner of Saul's robe because he viewed that as a taunt and as a dishonorable thing to do. I don't see anywhere in this chapter that he regrets taking the spear and water jar, which tells me he views this somehow differently.
Well, he's deriding Abner for not protecting him.
Yeah.
And so he's using it more as a specific, basically a taunt to Abner, because Abner wasn't doing what Abner was supposed to do.
Yeah. Right. So David and Abishai leave, and David goes up on the next hill over where there's some distance, and calls out to Saul's army, and really starts out talking to Abner and taunting Abner. Maybe taunting is the wrong word. Chastising Abner. What have you done? You've not been a very good protector of your king. He says in verse 15, are you not a man? Who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy the king your lord. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die because you have not kept watch over your lord, the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is, and a jar of water that was at his head. So Abner, we do not get Abner's response from this, but surely he was terrified. Surely he feared for the consequences of what could have happened, the near miss there, but also the consequences of what is Saul going to do to me? Surely he's going to be angry, and Saul is not a very patient man, and he might just kill Abner for being so negligent. Now, of course, we know that it was God who kept Abner and the rest of them in this deep sleep, and so Abner was never going to be successful in this. It was God's will that David and Abishai be able to go into the camp, but that is probably not how Saul is going to interpret the situation, and not how Abner is interpreting it either. So that's how David starts out. We don't get Abner's response, but we do get Saul's response because he recognized David's voice. He says, is this your voice, my son David? And David says, it is my voice, my Lord, O king. And what message does David have for Saul? He's able to talk. He's got Saul's attention because the spear and the jug are gone. What does he have to tell him? Yeah, Steve?
He gives him an opportunity to say why he's pursuing him. And he's also heavy-hearted because he feels like he's not a part of the Lord's heritage. So he wants to get that cleared up.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple important things here. Asking Saul again, why are you chasing me? Why are you doing this? Tell me what your reasoning is. Who is telling you to do this? They've had this conversation before, right? Chapter 24. They had this conversation, and Saul agreed that this was pointless and that David was going to be the next king of Israel. He recognized that David was not a threat to his life, yet this is happening again. So David, a little fed up with all of this, is saying, why are you chasing me still? I'm not coming after you. I'm not, we talked a couple weeks ago about the how David is breaking the pattern of what you would expect him to do, breaking the expectations. If he is this rebel force, if he is the one who's trying to sow chaos in the nation and destabilize things so that he can take over, then wouldn't you expect David to be, doing these kind of guerrilla missions and, acting as bandits and highwaymen and robbing the people as they're traveling from place to place and carrying out kind of terroristic missions in making things difficult and destroying things and undermining Saul's efforts everywhere he turns. Maybe when Saul goes out to battle against the Philistines, David has sabotaged their stores, their supplies, their weapons, all these things that are going to make Saul look foolish and make his reign very weak. David hasn't done any of that. Dave?
Well, a couple things I see
Mm-hmm.
is that had David killed Saul, that would have been like vengeance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's man's reaction.
Yes.
And what does the Lord tell us? Vengeance is mine.
Mm-hmm.
And mercy, show mercy. So
Yeah.
you've got to have a point for doing this. He taught. I look at that right there as a teaching moment for Abishai and David's troops.
Yeah.
So if he had killed him, that would have just been what anybody else, in the world would have done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like Alan was saying, a teaching moment for David, too. Because in chapter 25, he had an Abigail there to stop him from killing someone unjustly. There's no Abigail present right there. In fact, he has Abishai instead, who is encouraging him to kill Saul, who's saying, I'll do it for you. Will David still hold true to this standard that he has set, that God has said, that you shouldn't kill the Lord's anointed? David does well here, and his commitment has grown, his faith in God has grown even more, and his obedience is very good. Jeff?
So I was just thinking, it's a shame that Saul didn't pursue the enemies of Israel instead of David.
Right.
If he had gone after the Philistines or any of the others around, as much as he went after David, Israel would have had more peace. So,
Yeah, there's a good contrast there, because we see in several of the battles against the Philistines that Saul is paralyzed with indecision. He's not sure what he should do. He's fearful. He's not able to effectively lead. Not every time, but some of the times. And he's not been persistent in pursuing the Philistines and getting the job done. And remember, this was the primary reason why Israel wanted a king, and part of Saul's commission as his role of king. You need to defeat the enemies of the Lord. If he would quit worrying about chasing after David, who is not a threat to him, he's a threat to his lineage, sure, and a threat to Jonathan's rule, but Jonathan's already accepted this. And Saul's already been told there's no way that you can succeed in killing David or in keeping the rule in your own house. If he can just let David go, then there's still opportunity for him to do a good thing in his rule. Remember, and we've mentioned this a couple times, but this is important, even though God has rejected Saul and said that he is not going to be able to pass the kingdom on to Jonathan, God didn't strike Saul dead. He's still there. He's still ruling. And, I read one commentator that said Saul was king in name only by this point. I don't even agree with that. He's not king in name only. He is actually king. He is actually still the Lord's anointed. David recognized that. He still has the royal authority. He still has opportunity to do something good with his time as king, and even understanding that it's not going to go on to Jonathan, and that at any moment God could say that Saul's time is done. There's still opportunity for him to do well, to make better choices. And there's a real possibility that Saul will just die of old age, that he will go on and have all these years to be able to lead, and that God will give him some expression of mercy and allow him to build some kind of legacy as he is doing maybe a better job. And then it passes to David. But that's not how this is going to go, because Saul can't seem to get David out of his head. And Saul can't seem to accept the reality of what's going to happen. And really, this is the big part of why God had rejected Saul. If Saul was able to be this faithful and honestly assess what he needed to do, he probably wouldn't have gotten in this situation in the first place. Okay, so talking to Saul, David is saying, why do you chase after me? What have I done? What evil is on my hands? Who is telling you to do this? Yes, is this from the Lord? Is this from, some advisor of yours? Who is telling you that you should chase after me? And one of the things that he talks about here is how he feels like he is outside of the heritage of the Lord. He's outside of this communion and connection with God. Why would David feel that way? Actually surprises me a little bit when I read it. Yeah.
Well, you're driven into lands where there's idol worship, and it's all you are a part of, and it's part of the culture, and you're a part of that culture. There's always the possibility that you fall into that problem, that the temptation is there.
Yeah.
Especially if you don't have access, to the land where, they, I don't know, it's wrong thinking, but where they felt like God was and where the worship of God was.
Yeah. And they did often think of it that way, of God as being the God of Israel specifically, and that land specifically. And that is not exactly the right way to look at it, but even still, even if we want to put a slightly more positive take on it, in chapter 25, where was David when this feast day came? How was he going to celebrate whatever feast day this was? Yeah, he's out on the run away from Israel. He's on somebody else's land, kind of hoping for some hospitality to be able to celebrate this feast day. Is that the ideal situation for David? No, he should be able to be more actively a part of the worship and fellowship with his brethren and with his countrymen, to be able to celebrate these things together, to have the remembrances together, to worship at the tabernacle, at the holy sites together. Instead, he's on the run. He's got this priest who's with him, and he has communion with God as a result. He's able to hear what the Lord wants him to do, and he's able to worship, sure, but he's out in these pagan lands. He's not really with these other people who want to worship God. This is a hard thing for David. He feels like he is outside of the Lord's heritage. He's not on the land that was given to his family, that is supposed to be his inheritance. He's not on the land that he is supposed to rule over one day, the land that was promised to his people. Instead, he's out in various wildernesses and caves and hills, just struggling. And he doesn't know how long this is going to be, and it doesn't have to be that way. Because remember, for a time, David was there in Israel, there in Saul's court even, waiting for the day when Saul would die and David would be able to take over. That could have continued. But it didn't, only because of Saul. So David says, now in verse 20, "Now therefore let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea, like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains." Why does David call himself a flea?
Well, basically, Saul has bigger fish to fry in his dealings with the people who are actually his enemy.
Yes. This is David saying, I am not a threat to you. I am not going to kill you. I am not going to make your life hard. I am not going to destabilize your reign. you have bigger fish to fry. I like that. You have enemies to go fight. Leave me alone. And I think David means that. He's had 2 opportunities to kill Saul, and he didn't do it. So I really do think he means that. A little interesting note, when he says, like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains, the Hebrew word for partridge is literally he who calls on the mountains. And David is calling on the mountains over to Saul. So there's a little bit of wordplay there. But he's saying, I'm a single flea. I'm a bird flying in the mountains. You don't need to concern yourself with me. I am no threat to you. Steve.
You said some Psalm 19 was a recent selection.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a sort of resource of understanding this subject between Saul to David to. David talks to God. It says specific things and recorded in the Psalms. Saul,
Yeah, you know what?
which of interest?
Right. Yeah, you know, what Psalm of Saul do we have? What great expression of worship or faith do we have from Saul? That's not really the kind of man that he was.
He sounded a bit like a leader of the music or something, singing for years already.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this is what David has to say to Saul. What is Saul's response, and how does it compare to the response in 24? Yeah. In both instances, he is, softened by this, realizes he's done wrong. I think his wording is stronger in this chapter. He goes farther here than he did in 24. He is more pointed. He says, I have sinned. He says, return, my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly and have made a great mistake.
Which you said over and over before.
Yeah, sure. And David doesn't even necessarily believe Saul, and the reason we know that is Saul makes an offer here. Come back. Come back home. Come back to my court. Does David accept that offer? Does David even address that offer? He didn't even say anything about it. He completely bypasses it because there's no point in talking about that. We are so far past any possibility of David coming back to Saul's court or being able to be back in Israel safely. David does not trust Saul one bit, because Saul has already said these things before.
You know, I noticed in the next verse there, David is cautious.
Yes.
He didn't say send Abner over. Abner's a man of war.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. Abner might take an opportunity for revenge or something.
Sure.
Stuff. He says send a young man over.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he is very cautious in this. And yes, Lito.
I feel a bit of depression and disappointment on Saul's part, because of twice already that has been conquered by them silently, and he's supposed to be dead in the first time and the second time, but they're still he's alive.
Yeah. Some great fear and some depression and all of this, yeah.
David also puts his hands in the Lord, his life in the hands of the Lord.
Yeah.
He kind of dismisses Saul, he just says, as I spared your life, may the Lord spare mine.
Yeah.
He's more considerate of God taking care of him than Saul taking care of him.
Yes, absolutely. David is much more willing to trust in God than he is in Saul, for good reason. Saul's not shown himself to be very trustworthy. But here I think is where we see why David doesn't regret taking the spear and the water jar like he regretted cutting off the corner of Saul's robe. Because really they look very similar to each other and even could be the same depending on motivation. But David answers and says in verse 22, "Here is the spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and take it." You know, if cutting off the corner of Saul's robe, because remember we said sometimes those tassels could be used to show the authority of a message of somebody who wasn't there, and was a way of undermining Saul, a way of kind of breaking his covenant, faithfulness of not having the tassel there anymore. Taking the spear could represent a lot of the same things, but I wonder if David ever intended to really keep the spear, or took it at least with the same attitude. This seems less like a taunt and more like some plea of desperation. He's got to have some way to prove that he could have killed Saul, but he gives it right back over to Saul. See, you are still king. I know that. Here is your spear of royal power and authority. I'm not going to keep it, even though I could. Sue?
Something you mentioned earlier, though, this is kind of my thoughts on that, was when Saul and David were in the cave, it just kind of happened.
Yeah.
This time David purposely sought Saul out.
Yes.
And, went into the camp and took the spear of water and then offered it back. So to me, it's more like saying, listen, I could have killed you.
Yes.
I wasn't just hiding in the cave with you.
Yeah.
I sought you out.
Mhm.
I killed you. I'm trying to prove to you that I have no intention of killing you.
Yes, I think that's the right take on it. And God has even shown some approval of this by keeping them in this deep sleep while David and Abishai go in. Like, it was God's will that David and Abishai be able to get that close to Saul. I think it's also easy to show that it was not God's will for David to kill Saul, but this kind of action, not meant as a taunt, but meant as some sort of plea and some sort of proof of David saying, I really could have done this, but I don't want to, and you have to believe me. Lito?
Yeah, I think it's Saul's strength and courage of the spirit and his word. That is all he has in taking all this pursuit of David. But now, when David tried to take the spear and water, meaning, this is my thought, that he is trying to remove all his strength.
Yeah.
To try to teach him something that you cannot oppose God.
Right, and that's rich with meaning, because taking Saul's spear is kind of like saying, I'm taking your authority, I'm taking your power, I am more fit to be king. But giving it back over says, I know you are still king right now. I know you are the Lord's anointed, and I'm not going to jump the gun on this. Jeff?
Well, whenever you cut the piece off of Saul's garment, that's like dishonoring the king's wardrobe.
Yeah.
It's like, I shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
Stuff. When he took the spear, he didn't have some intention of keeping it. It's like, it was to prove a point. Here's your spear back.
Yeah.
This is your spear.
Yeah.
But he didn't destroy anything.
Yeah.
Before he did, he destroyed the king's, that's dishonor to the king.
Yeah. And that's why, these reasons are why I think this is a little bit different than what happened in 24, and why David doesn't show the regret afterwards. He's got this framed differently, and there's just a little bit of different meaning, even though there are a lot of similarities between the two. So David and Saul part ways. Saul says, "Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and will succeed in them." But at the end of it all, they still part ways. If I have read this correctly, and I think this is the last time that they're going to actually meet and actually be able to speak with each other. And Saul's going to have some time left before he's eventually killed in battle. All right, thanks everyone. Next week, I'm not going to be here, but there will be a sub for class, and we will continue on into the next lesson, if I understand correctly.